Hello again, can you all hear me? So we are going to be talking about quite a controversial subject in this part of the world, which is the university rankings. Not too long ago, I got a call from a Vice-Chancellor of another university in Johannesburg. And he said to me, "Tshilidzi, I have a brilliant proposal." I said, "What is it?" He said, "Let us withdraw from the university rankings." Then I said, no. Why don't you do it first? And then, and then I will follow you. Then he says, no, I can't do it first because I'm going to lose students. We have to all to do it at the same time. But I think rankings are important for a number of reasons. Just to give you one of the matrices that is used for ranking, the ability of our universities to raise funds is an important element. And if those of us who are participating in rankings, it makes us to raise more money because it is important for rankings, I don't think we can go against that. The other issue that is even more important for those of us who come from South Africa is the issue of internationalization. And not too long ago, we had xenophobic attacks, not very far from here. So it is important for our people to understand that they actually live in a global world. And one way of doing that is to take our staff and students to the rest of the world, particularly the African continent, and also to bring the world into our environment. Again, this is something that is quite important. But I also do understand that rankings are a zero-sum game. They're usually a zero-sum game, a field, which basically means that for a university to rise, normally another university should fall, especially if there is no tie. You do have ties, but it is not very frequent. And as a result of that, they become quite competitive. I know a ranking that looks at the most cited researchers. And you have universities that go and get all these most cited researchers according to Clarivate so that they can improve their ranking. So now, coming back to the continent, given our pressing needs that our continent is facing, should we invest in rankings? So I think this is really what this conversation is about. And I'm going to be the facilitator of this conversation. I will start by asking Professor Cotton just to give us opening remarks and his views.
Thanks very much, and greetings from Rwanda. I don't know about you, but when I was a child, I was often taken around relatives and sometimes taken to rather elderly, smelly aunts and who had no teeth and hairy chins, and I was instructed to kiss and hug them. And rankings are a bit like that. I kind of approach them with like this kind of thing. And yet what I want to do is nothing personal, Phil, of course, but what I want to do is to be able to embrace them in all their glory and in all their fullness, because I want to expose all the glory and the fullness of what we do as universities. And what we do as universities, I think, is service in the common good. And that's why we work together. That's why we're interested in meeting like this, because there's something that we do in the common good. And my starting point for university and for the University of Rwanda is love. And I need to be able to express that to my faculty and my students. So my starting point is love. My starting point is my moral responsibility to students. And the starting point then for what the institution does is its moral responsibility and articulation of that moral responsibility to the world that we serve. And we start with the nation of Rwanda and the region, and then move continentally and internationally. So there is a move now that all of our documents that we submit to the ministry, for example, in Rwanda, have to have a section saying financial implications. We're all used to doing that. But now there's a section that says benchmarking implications. Because people want to know how well we're doing. They want to know how other people are measured, because they want to know how to measure us. And I think that there is an essential need to embrace rankings so that we have some ownership of the way in which other people interpret the rankings. We want the right data in the right place at the right time, but we want the right interpretation of that data by the people who are indeed our funders and our policymakers in country and in the region. And yeah, there's a lot of obsession with things such as staff-student ratios within and by our regulatory bodies. And it bothers me greatly, because I think the regulatory bodies don't necessarily understand the organizations and institutions that they regulate. And so I want to make sure that when I embrace the rankings, that I can understand what is meant by staff-student ratios, for example. I can understand what is meant by international co-authorship, so that the people who interpret them and hold me to account for them also interpret them in an international context, in a regional context, and in a local context. And so yes, like my old aunt as a child, I think we should be embracing the rankings. And I look forward to further conversation on it.
No, thank you very much, Professor Olayinka.
Okay.
There's this issue of students to staff ratios that keeps on coming, especially with respect to rankings. I think it's an issue that we don't necessarily have to think about it in the context of ranking. How do you think we can improve our we can improve ourselves with regards to this dimension, given the limited resources that are around?
Okay, thank you. I think the student-staff ratio is very important, because if you have a classroom, I mean, in the conventional face-to-face teaching, you have a spacement for 200 students, and you pack 1,000 students there. So no effective teaching is going to take place. I just gave that arbitrary example. And because in the semester, you are supposed to have continuous assessments throughout the 15 weeks of the semester. So if a professor is now teaching 500 students without graduate assistants, so it becomes almost impossible for him or her to be able to do any meaningful continuous assessment. I think using this one as one of the criteria, I think it's very important for you to, because how can effective teaching go on if you have so much massification? The students will go to the hostel is a room that is meant for 2 students, you have 10 of them there. The hygiene, the health condition is going to be, in shambles. So I think some of these little criteria here and there is very important. Just like we were at a meeting last week in Hamburg, And one of the facilitators was telling us, during the breakout session, I was the only person there. So he said it's like the typical Oxford tutorial, where you have one research assistant and only one student. So teaching is going to be more effective, where you have small class sizes, even though I understand that, I appreciate the fact that everyone wants to go to the university and there's massification. But on the other hand, it's a challenge. Not to talk of laboratory, you are supposed to have one student to a microscope, an anatomy class. You now have 10 of them to a microscope. Or you do theory of practical. The facilities are not just there. So I think the teaching, the staff-student ratio is really very important. As a pseudo way of measuring effective teaching. I think that is the point.
Professor Norris, again on the issue of staff-to-student ratios, we are told that some universities are gaming the system. So they go and get retired 80-year-olds and give them a fraction of the cost of getting a lecturer and putting them on their books so that they can artificially raise this staff-to-student ratio. How widespread do you think that problem is, and how can we combat that?
Let me say, I'm not too sure whether it's a widespread problem. The reality is, for me, for instance, at the University of Botswana, I actually advocate for getting these old, experienced professors. I want them to come into my institution to help in teaching and mentoring of young staff members or emerging or upcoming researchers. I do bring them also into the classroom, wherever there's an opportunity. So in one instance, actually, you need them. But if you are going to use them so that you can better your staff-student ratio is another issue, which is very unfortunate and unethical, if I may say. But you need those people. You need the experience and the expertise.
Professor Sinha, coming to another dimension of rankings, which is industry support. We are told that quite a great deal of resources that are deemed to be industry support is basically about clinical trials, where the money just basically flows through the university, but the people doing the work are not even local people. Can you just give us some form of a comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much. I was initially, when I was put on this panel, I did not realize that you were going to be the chair. So I looked very carefully at the topic just to make sure that we have views that are in convergence, because I worried what if we had different views. So on the clinical trials, I must firstly just make clear for the benefit of the audience is that the University of Johannesburg does not as yet have a school of medicine. So this referral is certainly not to us. But speaking broadly, it is the case that you do find that income, it's a little bit like a donation. If you acknowledge the donation, it features in your book, it gives you, that positive measure, and it helps you in things like ranking. But if you'd allow me, I do think that maybe the aspect of industry income, we should look at it a little bit broadly. At the moment, we look at industry income purely in terms of, and I think the Times Higher Education definition is in terms of knowledge transfer. And perhaps there's an opportunity to expand the definition to knowledge and technology transfer. And that would then bring about the aspect of whether universities, we also invest in innovation leading to exploration of intellectual property, and how should that then be measured? And the other aspect is the industrial engagement. So as you know, we have a new tier called the Professor of Practice at the University of Johannesburg, and that's bringing expertise into the university from outside, and we would like to explore how that is then, how that is measured in a broader way, and not just in industrial income in its more narrower manner. So.
Okay, Professor Cotton, what are your views on this matter of industry support, particularly given the fact that in many of our countries, the industry is just not large enough?
Yeah, let me just touch on that other point, though. You know, I actually don't think in terms of staff-student ratios that teaching is the important thing at all. I think it's learning that's important, and I think also assessment. So, you know, unless we can look at attrition rates, the progress of students, the way in which they enhance their grades, I think we will be stuck with the wrong kinds of notions, but certainly learning and assessment is where I think we need to go. Industry collaboration is difficult for me because the development of industry is not as great in Rwanda as maybe in many of the other countries represented here. And so it's going back for me to determine, for example, in terms of industry attachments, what it is that we want students to get out of an industry attachment. We also have professors of practice, system and scheme as well, and we're trying to bring professional qualifications such as chartered engineering, such as CPA, into and part of the undergraduate curricula and the preparation for graduation for students. But when students go out on industrial attachments, for example, I want them to observe team working, I want them to observe health and safety, I want them to observe boardroom discussions, I want them to observe staff rewards and recognition schemes. I want them to observe an awful lot more than what they might initially imagine. In terms of industry collaboration, though, creating spaces where people can work together, industry can come and share space with undergraduate students, with researchers in the university, has been a really vitally important part of what we do. And I think it goes back to what you were articulating last night and what you said again this morning about opening our doors to the wider community and making ourselves accessible.
No, thank you. Professor Norris, I read somewhere that one of the big industrial company in Botswana invests more in research in European universities than Botswana universities. Can you just comment about that, and how do we, especially focusing on how we can be able to convince these companies to look at our local universities as sources of knowledge that they can be able to get to be equivalent to knowledge that they can get elsewhere?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very, very good question, especially in the context of Botswana. Having DBS or Botswana in Botswana. I think the reality on the ground is that universities sometimes, they are not proactive in engaging industry. When I joined a sister university at Botswana called Botswana International University of Science and Technology, I was receiving almost on a monthly basis applications for promotions, and based on the number of publications that they've made. And I was looking at these publications, scrutinizing them. The question that I was asking and posing to our researcher is, who are you doing this research for? Which industry are you solving challenges for? And you realize that these were imagined problems in an office setup. So we are solving imaginary challenges. I then say, have you been to the Botswana, to the mines? Because about 100 kilometers from the university, there's Orapa. There's the Morupulo coal mine. You have all these mining industries within 200-kilometer radius of the university. But we had never been there. So I said, let's go to these companies and see where we can work together. We went there, we were taken through Orapa mine, for instance, from the extraction of the ore to the crushing to the cleaning and everything. And they told us the amount of money that they spend outside Botswana, just for universities, for analysis and stuff like that, using universities here in South Africa, using universities in England, massive amounts of money. And the question is, why were we not proactive? They said, we want your assistance. So the reality is that the university were not proactive in engaging industry and establishing these linkages, which can bring in third stream income into the university system. Indeed, it's true. You have state-of-the-art labs in Imperial College in London, for instance, where all these things for the mines, the analysis, and all the research is done in there. But what have we shown them our capability? In actual fact, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, while I was at BUST, we started that discussion with a delegation from UK to say, can we do some of these things right here, right there in Botswana?
Professor Olayinka, I think Professor Norris basically says that the problem is that university-industry cooperation is not an efficiently executed system in our continent. What are your experience in Nigeria?
Well, I think the problem is a bit complicated, because when you look at the issue of this research that you are talking about, I mean, some of those of us here are in academia, then you have the private sector, the industry, but you also have the government, because the government has the responsibility to lay out the enabling environment as well as the policy nationally. So I think that there's a missing gap, because you cannot remove the role of government from this. Because if a company is operating in Nigeria and they want to do their R&D in Austin or wherever, the government has to tell them, do it within the country. And you have to, maybe you endow professorial chairs and fund them adequately. So I think so there's a missing gap. And you find out that those of us who are in academia and the industry, we don't speak the same language. I mean, we in the academia, we are more interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake. Whereas the industry, the bottom line is the profit. So they have to report to their board of directors at the annual general meeting. So I think that those are the areas that we need to improve upon. If we speak the same language, I think the point was also made yesterday that on your faculty boards or even in Senate, if you have people from industry there, so you can then understand their needs better than if you just sat in your office and you are imagining the kind of problems. Maybe a bank, recently the Central Bank of Nigeria came and they are trying to assist 3 of universities in Nigeria. We are just signing the MOU. The Central Bank is also a government outfit. So I think the role of government, academia, and the industry, we need more synergy as part of the triple helix. I think those are the missing gaps. The contribution of industry to research in the universities in Nigeria, I'm afraid to say, at least for now, is not optimal. We can still be a lot better for some of the reasons that I've tried to allude to.
One other element, Professor Sinha, of rankings is the diversity of your academic staff. And obviously, the reason why you want that, you want people to have different experiences. And I have seen a situation whereby South African universities take their students to Lesotho and claim that they are getting a diverse experience. We know that the languages that are spoken there are spoken in South Africa, and we know the closeness of the two countries. What is your comment? How far can we go? Should we exclude neighboring countries as international and only concentrate on countries that are far and different from us?
Thanks. That's a very interesting question. I think that I have some background to this because we have a program called Africa by Bus, and this program seeks to take students to other countries. And we started in the region. We take over 1,000 students into Lesotho, into Swaziland, into Botswana, Namibia, Angola, and the desire is also to expand this into Uganda and other parts. I want to share some experiences that our students have experienced through this process, and then I'll try and cover the Lesotho part as well. Hopefully I'll remember. When a lot of our students that join the University of Johannesburg are first-generation students. Many of them have not been into our neighboring countries. Many of them do not have passports. Mm-hmm. And we engage with them for the first time that can you go and get a passport. By the way, in Johannesburg, you can also get a passport in a bank, not just at the Department of Home Affairs. So we tell them, can you go get a passport at a bank? And then they don't understand. They look at us very strangely. What do you mean that you can get a passport in a bank? And then suddenly they start to realize that the banking system is changing its business. So that's the first experience about this aspect of going into a neighboring area, is to get that passport experience in a different setup and in an unusual setup. Secondly, when they go into another country, let's take Botswana as the example that you just gave of the Botswana, which is an interesting example. Because in South Africa, there is a debate that's going on about privatization and nationalization of certain key national assets, or certain key assets. And if you go into Botswana, you start to realize that there is a different model in which the Botswana contributes to the Botswana's economy. And so you learn about a different aspect of the strength that that country has, other than only the aspect of language. So when you go into Lesotho, you experience some snow. By the way, snow is a big deal. If you've been in Johannesburg or in certain parts of South Africa, you may not have seen snow, you see. So the experiences that the students get, even within the region, can be much more than only the aspects of them being closer. And we have also started, Vice-Chancellor, chair for the session, is to bring students from other countries onto these buses. And so they go together in a multidisciplinary and multicultural, and so there is a lot more to the bus journey. And they also experience the water contribution that South Africa and Lesotho experience together. So I think that there are certain experiences that are, beyond the cultural aspect where there are similarities, that the whole journey in itself extends. So I don't know, I think my answer to your question, I've given a long explanation, but my answer is that I do think that we should have a diversified experience, but we should also include countries that are right next to us, because I think we have the greatest chance from a geographical point of view to diminish those boundaries by building closer relationships with them.
Professor Cotton, one of the dimensions of internationalization is the staff component. As Vice-Chancellor of a university in Rwanda coming from England, how do you think African universities can be able to attract international staff, given the competitiveness of some of the wages or salaries that are offered elsewhere?
Yeah, the first thing, of course, is that I didn't come from England. I came from Scotland.
Oh.
And if you understand anything about England and Scotland, you'll know how desperately insulted I am by that. But
I actually wanted to say the United Kingdom.
I don't know if that's worse, actually, but no. But independence for Scotland. I turned up in Rwanda in 2006 and never ever anticipated that I would stay or that I would become Vice-Chancellor. So some things happen by accident and some accidents are not so good. But look, we've been looking long and hard at this because we have a history, of course, of expat faculty. So people who were brought in, 20 years ago to fill gaps, who have been teachers for 15, 20 years. And perhaps even the content of their teaching or their curriculum hasn't changed. And yet we have this small group of what I call international faculty. We share a research professor with the University of Massachusetts, for example, and is a leading researcher in primatology, looking at the boundaries between humans and primates and living space. And when you look at our international co-authored publications, they're coming from the international faculty. So we're making a transition from expat to international faculty. But you're right, one of the big issues is that of salary. Within a public university, how much we can pay people, how much we can give them in terms of rewards or benefits for coming to Rwanda. And And yet, you know, the education system has to liberate everybody who works in it before it can liberate those people that we serve. And so it is a particular challenge. And I was heartened watching the session we had yesterday morning on recruitment. I can't find the person who did the session now, Nick. And that salaries rated was something like fourth in terms of decision making for reasons why people would take an academic job in a particular country. And I think we're relying on people who have split appointments, split site working, but have the support of maybe an anchor institution. And while we would desperately like to be the anchor institution, that's not always going to be possible. I think it's a really difficult one, VC, that we haven't quite sorted out. My experience was that once you go to Rwanda and you fall in love with the place, it's actually very difficult to extricate yourself from the place. It's such a remarkable, amazing, beautiful country with quite a remarkable story to tell, and to be part of the move to develop the place has been an enormous privilege. So maybe that's another draw for people, but it remains a major challenge.
So, Professor Norris, Botswana's University of Botswana's staff composition is actually quite diverse, but your student population is not as diverse as your staff population. So, how do you strike a balance between domestic demands and the need to internationalize certainly your staff and students?
Let me hasten to concede that that's a challenge that we're facing. And you're very right. In terms of diversity in our staff, we're doing very well. And we set targets for ourselves that this certain proportion should be of people from outside Botswana. And we're doing very well in that regard. In terms of students, that's where we're struggling. And I think this goes back to the issue of rankings. If you think about it, for instance, I always ask myself, why would students come all the way from Nigeria, from Cameroon, from Ghana? They just pass my university and come to South Africa. Because I can say without hesitation that the University of Botswana is doing very well in terms of resources. I get visitors from all over the world that are in awe of the facilities that we have at the University of Botswana and the caliber of our staff. The question is, out there, are we a reputable institution? Maybe that is why, even myself, I'm thinking that this issue of ranking should be something that we seriously consider as the University of Botswana. And now, we talk about, I think we are saying about 5% of our students are international students, but they are really not. These are kids of parents that are already just working in United Nations organization in Botswana. So we consider them as international. They are not really international students. They are there, their parents are there, and therefore not regard them as international students. It's something that we're working on. That is why we've been to Seychelles, for instance. I'll be on a recruitment drive on the 15th of this month. I'm going to Nigeria, looking for students from Nigeria. I'll be there for the entire week. So it's something that we really are trying, because we are saying we have a good institution. We can attract students from all over. Thank you.
Professor Olayinka, Nigeria, of course, is probably the biggest exporter of staff and students. How about the other way around? How much do you attract staff and students from other parts of the world, and how do you improve that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for quite some time now, we've not been able to attract a lot of foreign staff and students. I mean, the staff is fairly straightforward because of just like the VC of University of Rwanda mentioned, because of the cost element, the economics, because you cannot remove the economics from it. And also because for the past 25 years or thereabouts, we've been having issues with a lot of staff union having disputes with the government. So to that extent, our academic calendar has been fairly unstable, then it makes it more difficult for us to attract. Our academic calendar is unstable. So because of that, we are not even many Nigerians now go to Ghana for their first degree. There was a girl that came to my office when I was a Deputy Vice-Chancellor academic. Her parents are from Ibadan. So she told me that she went to University of Ghana, Legon, for a BA in history. Then went to University College London for graduate studies. So I was asking her, why did you leave Ibadan and you went to Ghana? Why not go to, if you couldn't go to Ibadan, University of Ife or University of Lagos? These are first-rate universities. In fact, the first thing she said was strike. It said strike by the staff union. So somebody came for a 4-year course, for whatever reason, is delayed. So it's not really an incentive. So that's why if the calendar is a bit more stable, then we think we do better. Then in terms of staffing, because when our university, of course, was established 72 years ago, it was international. At any rate, it was just a college of University of London. Most of the staff were expatriates. But because for the instability in the system, it has been so difficult. But now we are host to the Pan-African University Institute of Life and Art Sciences. So we're able to have foreign students. Because we think it's also not good for, if you think university is supposed to be universal, it's not good for 99.9% of your population to just come from the country. Then we should be able to attract students from other parts of Africa, or even students from America who are on occasional studentship. We have a Yoruba language center, for example. Students come every now and then from the US to stay for maybe one semester. So we think with time it will improve. And that is also what I think is very important to the various bodies that are ranking universities, like the THE that is hosting us here, that if we think of what does it take to have a good university, forget about ranking. You have to teach your students very well, then your staff have to do good research, which will then result in publications and citations. And all this will then advise the criteria. So I think just like the income, because you talk of industry income, if your proprietor cannot provide all your funding, then you also need the private sector. And I think that is where the industry income comes in, because what does it take to build a world-class university? You need a high concentration of talent. Then you need abundant resources. Then favorable governance. I think those are the 3 main building blocks. All the other ones are subsets of it. So we think we need to improve by having more foreign faculty as well as foreign students.
No, thanks. We are almost running short of time. I would like to also open for the audience to interact. So I'm just going to ask you just one last thing about rankings, which is the issue of citation, which often people believe that it has no relevance on the impact of the research on the local conditions. Professor Sinha, quickly, what are your views?
Yeah, I think that the field-weighted citation impact, which is a primary input into the Times Higher Education, it has a disciplinary component, and the socioeconomic impact extends through also multidisciplinary, which is not as easily, the field-weighted citation is measured, but is not as easy. So I wanted to say that that research also impacts and influences policy, and I think that in the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, that we tend to utilize data that is easily available because that's what is available today. But I was asking myself, what would THE 4.0 look like? And how would that machinery collect data in future? And what would be the artificial intelligence? And what would be the machine intelligence? What would be the components of deep learning that it would utilize to collect and build a new type of citation impact that also seeks the relevance of research to policy aspects? And I think that this might seem very far, but if we think about it, I think we probably have the technology to realize that today.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Professor Cotton.
Yeah, no, thanks. I was very taken by something Phil said this morning, which was looking at bang for buck. And I think if we can look at our research output, at citation indices, in the context of our resources and in the context of the impact, I think we might be approaching a much more meaningful measure and metric.
Okay. Professor Norris?
Yes, the issue of citation, actually not only citation, there are a number of things that need to be tweaked in the way we rank, in the way we assess performance. But let me just confine myself to citation. It's a bit problematic because it really does not look at societal impacts. What would be the focus, the context of the university, what environment? And now you also look at disciplines. Certain disciplines citation will be higher. If you look at engineering, medicine, engineering, medicine, and the sciences. So there's a problem there because you find the social sciences, humanities, if your university is focused on that, usually your citation impact would not be that high, like a university that is more focused in those other disciplines that I've just mentioned.
Professor Olayinka?
Thank you. And I think if we started from first principles to the fact that for a university, whether it's in Nigeria, Botswana, or America, wherever, three main functions: teaching, research, and the societal impact. And in all of this, research is very central. Because if you have a university where no research is conducted, then you are not any different from a glorified secondary school. And in terms of citation, I think you are dealing with the publications. So I guess that is why it has to, we cannot run away from it. Because, I mean, the typical lecturer who has a PhD who joins your university, he or she thinks that maybe 20 years down the line he wants to become an associate professor or a reader, so why not? And so he has to publish in reputable journals. So I think that is it, because people now talk of whether it's a Scopus, ResearchGate, or Google Scholar, what is your H index. So I think the citation index is really very critical, because it's central to the role of university. Research is central, because it's only research that is going to influence your teaching, as well as the societal impact. If you don't do any research, then you are not, you are not just there. Not so much as if you are competing. Because when your faculty members are applying for grants, they want to see, do you have one or two relevant publications in this discipline? So I think that, I wouldn't know the percentage or how much weight should be attached to it, but I think it's really very central. If all of us agree that any university worth its salt has to be top there in research, make every effort. We may not be there, we're not necessarily competing with Harvard or Imperial College or Manchester.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor for discussion. Professor Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a bit of a difficulty with this discussion, and I'll tell you why. The question is wrongly formulated. Should African universities care about the global university rankings? The answer can only be yes, and you articulated it very well. But that is not the problem. The question is, what kind of rankings should African universities participate in, and what should be measured? Because a ranking is a measure of performance. Performance for the purposes of what? You said it, Chair, and I'll quote you, but use my words. Transforming lives, transforming communities, transforming societies, and making a contribution to the world. If that is the point, why is that we have a situation here where we have rankings that are only based in the north? They don't have a presence on the continent. Look at what we have just behind you. THE African Universities Forum in partnership with UJ. I think that is good. Actually, it should be THE African Universities Forum in partnership with African Universities Association. And on that basis of that partnership, you then determine what kind of criteria you are going to use to measure performance relative to the context and relevance to that situation. Because surely I still do not understand that you could measure my university, which actually I'm not complaining about where I am in these rankings. Not really. The problem is that not all I do is actually being measured. So my university is 111 years old, University of Pretoria. Oxford is 999 years, if not 1,000. That time period, and I think Phil acknowledged it in his presentation, matters in this business we are talking about. Oxford is responsive to the context in which it is. It is a research-intensive university. It's a research university. Mine is a research-intensive university in a country with so many centuries of colonialism and apartheid, and only has been democratic for 25 years. My university is much more diverse demographically than Oxford University. If that was a measure, the Oxford will come down a number of rankings. But that is not key to this ranking here. Now, you talk about staff-student ratios. My university staff-student ratio is the worst in this country. But my university, as you acknowledged at dinner last night, produces the most research. Not all of it high quality, and we are working on that. But that will not show in these global rankings. So here is my suggestion so that I don't sound like I'm just complaining. Let's reform the rankings, the global ranking systems. And the global ranking systems must be reformed this way. Each country must create a national ranking system, which must take into account context and relevance. It must then participate in a ranking in its continent, which must take into account relevance, context, ability, availability of resources, historic advantage, ability to actually be able to be, proactive in the context in which you are. Then, at the global level, all of those rankings must be put into criteria that are fairly transparent, clear to everybody. You do not measure apples against oranges, and you weight whatever you want to weight for historic advantage. Then we have a genuine partnership. Then we have a world in which we all operate together for the same purposes. What we have now is essentially THE is a business, and that is not a crime. I'm not saying there shouldn't be a business. But as a business, you have to operate with certain parameters which make sense to you. But that cannot be escalated onto the global platform. So I want a partnership. Rankings, we must have rankings. But our rankings must be measuring the real performance of universities in relation to transforming the world. And you don't transform the world without transforming individuals, communities, and societies. So if we then agree on that basis, THE is going to be a huge resource. They've been doing this for years. They have some expertise, they have some skills, and so on. THE becomes a secretariat to a global ranking systems. QS must come into Shanghai, must come into they create a global secretariat. We could use the United Nations and UNESCO for that. And then actually we're very intelligent, contextual, continually changing criteria. Remember, the SDGs are also managed by the United Nations. Why not put everything into a multilateral platform? And THE must be paid for that because they are a business. You can't forget that. Now, second, I also wanted to say the following. You see, there is a problem. And this problem was raised yesterday. That essentially when it comes to research, if you are not operating in the English language, you are out of the game. What about those regions of the world where wonderful knowledge is being produced, which has relevance to transforming the world and creating a better world, but are not in an accessible language? They will not reach the citations, they will not have global international partnerships. Aren't we supposed to create a multipolar world which is multicultural, diverse, equal, and more democratic, and we promote human understanding? I don't think that does it. But it is, the person who's guilty is not THE. It's that we Africans particularly are not thinking properly. What stops us from creating our own ranking and engaging THE in a ranking that is better constructed?
I'm going to take another comment from the floor before I ask the panel to hear. Yeah? If you could just also introduce yourself.
Thank you. I think I also want to tap onto that because I had a close look and a thought on the question, should South African universities care about? And I think I agree the question is yes, or the answer. And then I want to tap on Prof. Cotton's comment about the relative, that we all struggle to kiss when we are young. But as we grow older, we luckily tend to start caring for that relative. But now it becomes an issue for me about resources. I can do I have the resources to actually go to that aunt that I care about? And I think that's a real issue because the context that I work in, I engage with many universities on the African continent, and I see a risk sometimes when I look at these rankings is that if you are geared well enough to report And I know we have to, we can only manage what we can measure. So that's an inherent function of us. But these questions are asked a bit broader. And I know at Stellenbosch, we've really set up a information governance unit, and the resources required for that is extensive. I just have a question with other universities is, are those resources there? So it can be at the end of the day a case that those that are ranked high are those that are able to report well and were able to put the resources into the ability to report well. And then, you know, it becomes skewed at the end of the day. So I like the suggestion that Prof. Cooper has mentioned about, you know, looking at local relevance, maybe other indicators. And I think there can be value therein. So it's a bit of a comment. First I thought maybe feedback from the VCs. It's not every day that we have so many VCs around the table. But the experience is about the resources required to be able to report, which can at the end of the day be a hindering factor, and then influence the standing or the level where you are at the end of the day. Thank you.
Okay. I see a hand on the other side.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to further, you know, comment on what Tawana said. You know, for me, I think it's quite interesting in terms of the context in which we are discussing this issue. And I'm just wondering, are African universities still having the right tool to assess for promotion of their staff? Because if you look at how we assess the promotion of staff, it's all on issues of impact factor, what type of journal, etc., etc. So, wouldn't it be a good idea to try and readdress that? Because, I mean, the issue of citation is a very interesting one. Impact sometimes is a promise of a promise in terms of what the journal can deliver. If you look at the VCs here and you look at us on the other side, if they were to publish on a subject area that is specific to them, they certainly will derive a low impact factor simply because of it's a game of numbers. And here on our side, we are going to generate a lot of impact factor because we are going to be referencing each other amongst ourselves. So I'm just wondering, wouldn't it be a good idea to start thinking of a unit, a standard that can be used in universities to be relevant to the environment in which we operate in terms of promotion? I've challenged my staff at the AAS to say, you know what, we've got AAS open now. Because of that, and because of the fact that we are not going to be able to say, this is the citation that we are going to have for the public.
You would have to conclude so that we can give others to...
Yeah. So, you know, clearly I was just saying that, I mean, we probably maybe need to be a bit more relevant to our environment in terms of how we measure the success of a lecture at the university.
Thank you very much. Any other question?
No,
if we have a question on the other side.
Good morning. My name is Siza Makubane from the Investor. I'm from the...
Yeah, I think it's...
I'm from the Investor of South Africa. And actually, I'm just wondering, especially after the last speaker, about the relevance of rankings for distance education institutions. And I'm actually wondering, and I would like to hear from the panel what they think about rankings for distance, for distance education institutions. We are an African university. We are the biggest. We are the only one that carries the name South Africa. We have the biggest number of students in the country and in Africa, if I may put it that way. And I'm thinking as I'm listening to all the speakers, starting from this morning, to say, what do I go back and tell my Vice-Chancellor and my VPs about the rankings and our role as a distance education institutions? I would like to hear from the panel.
Thank you very much. One last question. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the panel to answer. It's a question of resources. How do we mobilize resources to be able to participate in ranking? How about having a continental ranking system? I think that also talks about participation in ranking, because many universities are not participating. And then there was an issue of the fact that these measures that are used for ranking seem to be the same measures that are used for promotion of staff. And then, where does distance education actually comes in? And while you are answering those, I think you should also make a little bit of recommendations as to how do we get our governments, if we believe that rankings are important, to basically factor into account into the funding formula our participation in such initiatives. Saurabh?
Okay, so I think that, when we started in the preamble, you mentioned whether we should invest. And I think that perhaps we should think, because we're always going to be under resource constraints, and maybe the question we should ask is, how do we innovate? And I'm just thinking of one or two examples. I do want to get onto the aspect of global versus local versus what could be glocal. And I think maybe I'll first touch on the innovate part very quickly. We talked about the student-staff ratio earlier on, and about 2 weeks ago I was doing an online course on GDPR. And when I was doing this, I changed my screen. It was a screen, and very quickly, when I went back onto the website where I was doing the course, I had a quiz. So the moment I was absent from the class, I was immediately challenged, and then I suddenly realized that if we start to innovate in terms of what could constitute the lecturer or the facilitator of the future, and how that could complement the individuals in the classroom, we may have new ways of looking at student-staff ratio. But I do like the aspect of the local ranking that Professor Cooper mentioned. You will in fact recall that in November 2016, we started that conversation about what could constitute a Johannesburg or South Africa ranking. And in fact, the Sustainable Development Goal conversation actually came about from there, was the aspect of, and we see here, the aspects of inequality, the aspect of gender diversity, and you can see in our panel there is that lack too. And that was actually a conversation that started, and I think maybe the next question is, how do we scale that, and how do we scale the contribution of a local relevant component in the global set of indicators, and how do we nuance that? And maybe another indicator that comes about is the Universitas 21 indicator, which is a club of research-focused universities, which does a South Africa countries-wide ranking. And maybe that's another aspect that needs to come into this as a factor. But so I don't think we should altogether put aside what happens at the global level, because we do have to be able to compete on a global scale. And with virtualization, we will have, if a job is being automated in China, that job that is being lost in South Africa. So we have to be in that space of a global. So that would be my short answer to that.
No, thank you very much, Professor Cotton. If you would respond, and also maybe just give us a comment as to whether the rankings actually impede or promote our ability to respond to the local social and political and economic challenges.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to pick up on Nelson's point, because I think the issue about promotion is a really touchy, sensitive issue within our universities. But so too is what I've said already, the assessment of students and the progression of students, the preparedness for university at the end of secondary school. And I think there is just so much variation within countries, but also continentally, that we need to try and understand a little bit better. So being promoted to associate professor in Ibadan has some meaning from the University of Rwanda's perspective, and vice versa. And the same with students. Because are we functioning more like a glorified secondary school, as you say, or a vocational training institution, yet we're calling ourselves a university? How do we get some measure on that? I love Tuana's point, and I completely agree. And one of the things we were talking about yesterday is lack of differentiation within the system. So within my country, you have your own ranking, but there's only one public university, and it has as many students as the 30 private universities. It's the only one producing research. It's the only one with PhD training. What metrics are they going to use to rank? But I do agree, I think we need to move to a continental ranking system. Look, for me, I can chase rankings, or I can chase the lives of the young people that we serve, and I can chase the lives of the communities that we serve. I know what I want to be chasing, but I need a touching place. I need a touching stone. I need somewhere to go back to at the end of a day of chasing the lives of young people. And maybe that place I go to in part is THE rankings. Just to make sense of some of the measures. So that again is something of the relationship I have with rankings, but also ensuring that chasing one thing doesn't stop you from chasing something that's perhaps more important.
No, thank you, Professor Norris.
Yes, I'll just touch on all the questions very briefly. I fully agree with Prof. Kupe. Really, a generic assessment model is not ideal. But as a starting point, I think it's important that we do periodic revision of these assessment tools. So I fully agree with you. In terms of the resources that needs to be put, that's very, very critical. And I think the biggest problem with many African countries is data capturing and management. If you don't have that in place, if you have weaknesses there, then you have a problem. That is why you have institutional planning offices. Some universities do not even have institutional planning offices. If you don't do it, then how are you going to gather this data, make sense out of this data, analyze it, manage it for decision making and so forth? So institutional planning offices become very, very critical for managing data. The issue of distance learning, I think it's a profoundly important question. I mean, if you look at increasing or enhancing access and participation, UNISA will then probably be number one in the rankings. But are we really measuring increasing access and participation? We're not. So UNISA will not appear in the top 10. So that's another issue. Those are the things that should be incorporated in these assessment models. The issue of promotion criteria is also very important. We need to revise these things. Say, for instance, in a university setup, you come up with an innovation that can change lives, but you have not taught much, you don't have papers and top-notch journals, then you may not be promoted according to the existing criteria. So all these things we need to look at holistically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Olayinka.
Well, I think I agree with all the points that have been canvassed. I think if we think we are marginalized in the global scheme in terms of the ranking, then we can also come up with a ranking scheme that is acceptable to most African universities. And I think THE is already doing that. They have one, I mean, because I think you showed a slide earlier in the day where it looks at some universities in Africa. I'm sure the criteria can still be fine-tuned so that most of these points can be incorporated. And just the last word on promotion, I think because for a university academic, he or she is expected to participate in teaching students, which is very critical. Then the research and the societal impact. I think now most universities now insist that students should assess their lecturers. So even if you are publishing all the topmost journals in your discipline and you're not teaching students, then nobody is going to even consider you for promotion. Then if you have come up with innovations, then it's also recognized if you have patents and the rest of them. So the idea is that you look at more criteria. It's not just to have publications in the top journals without teaching students, which is why you are engaged in the first instance. So I think THE can look at some of these criteria and look at, I mean, I'm sure it's work in progress, so that you can have something that is more accessible. Like you said, you cannot have one for University of Botswana. Then Nigeria will also come up with its own scheme. How do you compare? And the truth of the matter is, when you look at a promotion, which you have said is very critical, I live for University of Ibadan, and I'm sure for most other universities, when our colleagues want to be, go from senior lecturer to reader or professor, we send their publications to people in other jurisdictions outside our country, to Botswana, to professor in Cape Town or Stellenbosch. So that's the issue of quality assurance. The idea is somebody who is senior lecturer at Ibadan can also be senior lecturer in Botswana, because it's the same university system, whether you are in Nigeria, you are in North Africa, or you are in Europe or America. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I think let's give them a round of applause. And this is the end of the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.